Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 12 of the Resilience Rundown. I'm your host, Thomas Bryant, and I'm joined today by Dan Conrad from Commvault. Thanks for being here, Dan. And could you share a bit more about your role as a principal technologist and as part of our Fiedld CTO team?
Sure. So, as you said, I'm part of the Fiedld CTO team, but my specific charter is to embrace all things Active Directory and Active Directory security related, which maps right to my background of 24 plus years of Active Directory experience.
Well, that's great because that's what we're going to talk about today. And I think it's something that a lot of folks in our industry do tend to overlook when they're planning for cyber incidents. Is authentication and specifically Active Directory and now Entra ID. And so I'm curious what you're seeing out there, having been in the field for so long. What are the most common threats that are affecting Active Directory today?
Things haven't really changed as the most common threats. It's mostly people, right? And that's a very broad statement. People and processes and, mentalities. Even if I think back to the way I used to administer Active Directory and even design Active Directory, I look back 15 years, it was terribly flawed mentality, right? Because I wasn't really planning for disasters, perhaps. The way I used my own elevated privileges was rambunctious, maybe. And then, keeping all of that in my back pocket and with the ability to operate autonomously and very dangerously is, how we did it. But, really people in that perspective, in that creating dangerous situations or exploitable situations. And then the users themselves, right? So the users are always going to be users. We want to enable them to be just users with a mentality towards security, but we don't want to have to train them on the in-depth levels of cybersecurity required to operate in an Active Directory environment. So we have to keep that in mind.
Yeah, so I suppose keeping it simple, right? The KISS mentality,
right,
is always applicable. So you mentioned something about elevated privileges, and it kind of goes back to like my AD days of when I first got started. A lot of what I did was just you had one account and you were a domain admin, and that's kind of what you did. And then they kind of split off, and we created just our standard user account, elevated credentials. Are there other changes that have kind of come along in terms of the evolution of like best practices, but also kind of related to that? Are there new threats that are emerging over the past few years as it relates to that?
So threats haven't really changed. I mean, if you look back at when Active Directory rolled out in 2000, it was just as vulnerable, more vulnerable than it was today. Okay. But, the way admins operate is changing quite a bit with this mentality of, when I worked on the network, I would run all over the network with domain admin credentials, fix anything, do anything. I was empowered to do so without understanding the problems that I was actually creating by doing that, by the way Active Directory works and the single sign-on nature of Active Directory makes it very easy for users to use and admins, that we leave footprints everywhere we go. And those footprints are exploitable by attackers. So whether you're a regular user or a privileged user, your footprints are usable by an attacker, NTL hashes and things like that. You've heard about, the cool phrased breaches like pass the hash and Kerberoasting and that sort of thing. That all starts with a user and a compromised credential. Colonial Pipeline, that was a user and a compromised credential. The big OPM breach, which affected me drastically. That was a compromised, in that case, it was a compromised domain admin credential that caused the problem. But I was just like you. I had my account, my regular account, I think it was probably D Conrad, was a domain admin, and it was hooked to a mailbox. Terrible idea, right? So great advances in security. We separated those two accounts. I operated as, I checked my email as D Conrad. I operated as my domain admin credential, whatever that was. Huge step in the right direction. But we're also seeing things like PAM solutions. So instead of me having my own domain admin credential in my back pocket all the time, I have the right to check one out and use it. And that's much more, efficient from a security perspective, because every time I'm done using it, I check it back in and it changes the password, which nullifies all those hashes I just left across the network so that they can't be exploited.
Okay. So, I mean, when it comes to these attacks and people doing exploits, you mentioned like that the hashing, but are there any, and you even gave some really good real world examples, but are there other techniques that people that the bad actors are coming after other than just hashing passwords and trying to kind of follow in footsteps?
There are. I mean, I'm a big fan of some, cybersecurity podcasts and things like that. And the ones that always I just fix on are social engineering.
Yeah.
If you ask somebody for a credential, they will give it to you. In fact, I was working with a red team, and their first method of attack is to simply ask for credentials. And he said 50 to 75% of the time, you get a credential on the network, or even have somebody log you in on their workstation and hand you a keyboard. It works. So, you would think that'll raises flags with us who know, but how common is that really? And when things are attacked, we've seen an evolution of what actually happens. So you take the Target breach of 2013 was interesting, right? Because that was a third-party vendor who was exploited, and they actually had a domain trust relationship with Target. I think it might have been an HVAC vendor. And so what happened there was they stole credit card information, right? And then the OPM breach, they stole the attackers stole what's called the eQuip database, which maintained all the security clearance information for every federal employee. Well, that was me at the time. So they got that. As part of that breach, the OPM offered us Equifax credit monitoring, which then Equifax was breached. So there's this change. So they were stealing information then. Now they're actually ransomware is the word, right? So instead of stealing information, they may additionally be stealing information, but the main concern is, a shipping company like Maersk was shut down. Colonial Pipeline started to get attacked, and then they shut some things down to avoid further attack. But these places, had to rebuild. How do you rebuild 45,000 workstations and 4,000 servers to get a shipping company back online? It's a different type of attack today, in the end result than it was in the past.
Yeah, I mean, so are there best practices that you're seeing folks employ? I mean, we mentioned the separating usernames or the different roles and some PAM ideas, but are there other things that folks are doing to secure Active Directory against these threats?
There's always the standard thing, right? We always say patching, like patching. You got to patch everything. You have to. And there's things you can do in Active Directory to make it more secure, but it also makes it less usable to some legacy applications. So you have to realize what you're doing. You have to be aware of what you're actually sacrificing when you do that. The important thing is to know everything you need to know, everything you can possibly know about Active Directory, about the security of it, how to secure it, and even the compromises that you've made to keep applications that use Active Directory functioning. But when we're scanning for threats, we're looking for misconfigurations, we're applying best practices, there's an underlying mentality there that we know what we're looking for, right? So when we're looking for threats, we're looking for misconfigurations, maybe there's a new 0-day that comes out. Well, how do you protect against unknowns? And to me, I'm looking at things like the NIST framework, and way down at the bottom is the ability to recover. That's when all else fails in the top of the stack, right? Like, well, as long as you can recover, things are looking a lot better for you. That's sort of my mentality, that safety net that, you think you know how to detect, you think you know how to patch, you think you know how to do all this stuff. But if you can't recover, none of that really matters, because there's going to be something you didn't know about.
Yeah. So, I mean, on that tact, like on that same line, what do you see the role of backup and recovery in terms of protecting AD? Is it just purely as like a safety net for when I need to rebuild, or are there people also doing recoveries where they're kind of putting the pieces back into what they already have?
I've lived that scenario a few times. I remember having a meeting on a Thursday afternoon or something like that, and we decided we're not going to clean up SID history on a legacy domain. And I was on call, and I was on call for Europe, and I lived in the US. So about midnight, I start getting phone calls. People in this community couldn't access things, without saying specifically who I worked for. But I realized somebody just cleaned up SID history.
Oh, no.
So now I've got to go put 40,000 SID histories back, right? So I've also made mistakes, right? I mean, I've deleted an OU full of users. Oops, things like that. So that's very frequent. The other side of that is having the ability to recover at a granular level is sort of a very relaxing feeling, right? So I can run a script that will do something to a bunch of Active Directory objects. And if I did it wrong or changed my mind, I can undo that, Control Z for Active Directory. And with that, instead of going through, 5,000 objects manually to make sure I don't make a mistake, I can write a script that does it. And if I did the script wrong, or if I change my mind, I can still roll it back.
That is a good feeling. I've made my fair share of mistakes with like GPOs and things, and
absolutely,
it makes for a bad day sometimes.
I've lived through that one. If you link a GPO to the wrong location, bad things can happen. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the I forget what it's called, like because of how they inherit, right?
Right. Local site domain OU, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You might have some bad things. So I've backup has saved my bacon more times than I care to count when it comes to.
I did have one situation where a customer called me in, and they had been practicing Active Directory in production, building domain controllers, deleting domain controllers, just to document the process, and they were doing it in production. And they had thought that the machine they were working with had been demoted from domain controller status, and they saw DNS was still running on it, so they deleted the DNS zone. It was the production Active Directory DNS zone. Kind of a problem. So now, really, there's nothing you can do there but either start all over or recover. So recovery was the best option for them.
Yeah, that's not a fun day. Well, thanks for being here, by the way. So hopefully, we try to keep these relatively short, very interesting. I love learning about Active Directory. It's been something that was near and dear to me for a long time. If people want to learn more about Active Directory, or they want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
On LinkedIn, look me up. I'm Dan Conrad on LinkedIn. I think it's LinkedIn Conrad Dan is my title on LinkedIn, but easy to find, or dconrad@commvault.com. Happy to speak to anybody anytime about AD security.
Awesome. Well, folks, for those of you that are watching, we'd love to hear more about what you're doing to protect your Active Directory, and leave us some comments so that we can interact with you as well. So thanks for watching the Resilience Rundown, and we'll see you again soon.